There comes a moment in certain lives when everything familiar begins to feel strange. Not wrong, exactly, but foreign. As if you've returned to your childhood home only to find the furniture rearranged by invisible hands. You walk through rooms you've known for years, yet nothing occupies the same space it once did. This is what happens when consciousness shifts beneath your feet, when the ground of your being transforms, while the world around you remains steadfast in its old configurations. I've watched this unfold countless times, in my own life, and in the lives of those who've sat across from me, eyes wide with a mixture of wonder and terror, asking the same question: why does everything feel so different now? Let me tell you what nobody warns you about when you begin this journey. Spiritual awakening, personal transformation, whatever name we give to this fundamental shift in perception, carries with it a peculiar kind of exile. It's the loneliness of the caterpillar who begins to sense wings forming beneath its skin, while surrounded by other caterpillars perfectly content to inch along familiar leaves. They cannot fathom what you're experiencing because they haven't experienced it themselves. You try to explain the strange tingling, the inexplicable knowing that you're meant for something beyond this leaf, this branch, this tree, but your words land like seeds on concrete. The other caterpillars look at you with concern, perhaps even pity. "You're thinking too much," they say. "Just eat the leaf. That's what we do. That's what we've always done." The transformation doesn't ask your permission. It simply begins, often triggered by crisis or loss or some inexplicable opening in the fabric of your ordinary life. You might lose someone you love, face a health crisis, or simply wake one morning with a question you cannot shake. Is this all there is? And once that question takes root, once you genuinely ask it, and wait for an answer beyond the platitudes society offers, something irreversible begins. You start seeing through things that once seemed solid. The career you pursued with such determination now appears as an elaborate game of status and survival. The beliefs you inherited without question suddenly reveal themselves as constructs, useful perhaps, but no more absolute than children's stories. The very identity you've built so carefully, defended so fiercely, begins to shimmer like a mirage, and you realize with equal parts liberation and terror that you've been living inside a story someone else wrote. This is when people notice something different about you, even if they can't articulate what it is. You haven't changed your hair, or lost weight, or gotten a new job, yet there's something altered in your presence. Something that makes old conversations feel hollow. You sit at dinner tables with people you've known for decades, and the small talk that once flowed effortlessly now requires enormous effort. They discuss politics, gossip about neighbors, complain about traffic, and you understand these are simply ways humans connect, rituals of belonging. But you can no longer participate with your whole being because part of you now observes from elsewhere, from a vantage point that sees these conversations as theater, as elaborate dances we perform to avoid deeper questions. You love these people. You genuinely do. But you're watching them from across a widening chasm, and you don't know how to build a bridge back. Here's what I want you to understand about growth, about genuine transformation of consciousness. It requires vulnerability that most people will do almost anything to avoid. Think of the lobster, that ancient creature who must shed its protective shell in order to expand. During this molting period, the lobster is completely exposed, soft and defenseless against predators, against the crushing pressure of the ocean itself. It must hide in the rocks and wait for its new shell to harden, a process that takes weeks. Many lobsters die during this time. The risk is real. The danger is not imagined. Yet without this shedding, without this terrifying exposure, the lobster cannot grow. It will remain confined in a shell that becomes increasingly cramped, increasingly suffocating, until that shell becomes a prison, and then a tomb. When you outgrow your old identity, When you shed the shell of conformity and conditioning, you enter this same vulnerable state. The beliefs that once protected you, the social roles that gave you security, the tribe that offered belonging, all of these fall away, and you stand naked before existence itself. People sense this vulnerability, and it makes them uncomfortable. Your transformation reminds them of possibilities they've buried, questions they've learned not to ask. Some will try to pull you back to normalcy, offering advice that essentially says, "Put your old shell back on. We need you to be who you were." Your growth threatens the stability of our shared illusions. Others will simply distance themselves, as if transformation were contagious, as if your willingness to face uncertainty might somehow infect their carefully maintained certainties. You begin to see things others don't see, or perhaps can't see, or perhaps choose not to see. The materialistic values that drive so much of modern life reveal themselves as desperate attempts to fill an inner void with outer acquisitions. You watch people chase money, status, and possessions with religious fervor, and you understand these pursuits as sophisticated forms of running away from themselves. This isn't judgment. How could it be, when you recognize you did the same thing for years, for decades perhaps, but you can no longer participate in the collective delusion that accumulation equals fulfillment, that external validation can substitute for internal knowing. The separate self you once believed yourself to be, that isolated ego desperately trying to control and predict and survive, begins to reveal its illusory nature. You start experiencing yourself not as a separate thing in the universe, but as an expression of the universe itself, a temporary wave in an infinite ocean, distinct but not separate. This perception changes everything. When you recognize that consciousness itself is more fundamental than the material world, that reality is far more fluid and mysterious than the solid, objective universe science describes. You cannot return to conventional ways of seeing. It's like learning a magic trick. Once you know how the illusion works, you can never watch it the same way again. The trick doesn't fool you anymore, even though you can still appreciate the artistry. So you move through the world appreciating the artistry of consensus reality, while simultaneously seeing through it. And this double vision creates a peculiar kind of exhaustion. They call this living between two worlds. And let me tell you, it's a delicate navigation that requires constant adjustment. You must function in the conventional world of bills and jobs and social obligations. You cannot simply opt out of practical reality because you've had spiritual insights. The mortgage doesn't care about your awakening. Your body still needs food. Your relationships still require attention. So you learn to speak both languages, the language of the marketplace and the language of the soul. You discuss retirement accounts while internally recognizing the cosmic joke of planning decades ahead, when you've realized the present moment is all that truly exists. You engage in career advancement while understanding success and failure as equally ephemeral. You participate in society while seeing society as a collective dream from which most people never wake. But here's the challenge nobody mentions. You feel truly at home in neither world. The conventional world feels too shallow, too concerned with surfaces, too invested in maintaining illusions you can no longer sustain. Yet the spiritual dimension, vast and luminous as it may be, doesn't pay the rent or show up for your child's school play. You must inhabit both simultaneously, must develop what the Buddhists call skillful means, the ability to engage with relative reality while remaining rooted in ultimate truth. It's exhausting. It's lonely. There are days when you'd give anything to return to the simplicity of not knowing, to the comfortable certainty you once inhabited. The discomfort others feel around your transformation manifests in surprising ways. Family members who once celebrated your achievements now express concern. You've changed, they say, and it's not a compliment. You used to be so fun. Now you're always thinking about deep stuff. Friends stop inviting you to gatherings because you've become, in their words, too intense. Colleagues who once enjoyed your company now keep conversations safely superficial, sensing that something about you unsettles the office equilibrium. Within religious communities, this reaction intensifies. If you were a devout Christian who begins questioning literal interpretations of Scripture, who starts seeing Jesus as one enlightened teacher among many rather than the sole path to salvation, watch how quickly the congregation turns from welcoming to hostile. If you were raised Muslim and begin exploring consciousness beyond Islamic frameworks, your family may treat you as lost, corrupted by Western influences, in need of correction or intervention. The hostility makes sense when you understand what's happening beneath the surface. Your transformation threatens the stability of their worldview. If you can change so fundamentally, if you can question beliefs they hold sacred, what does that say about the certainty of their own positions? You become a mirror reflecting possibilities they're not ready to face, questions they've agreed not to ask. So they react defensively, trying to fix you, convert you back, or failing that, expel you from the group. This is how ideological systems maintain themselves. They cannot tolerate genuine uncertainty or open-ended seeking because such qualities undermine the foundation of absolute belief. You're no longer a heretic in the classical sense. You're simply someone who's outgrown the container of inherited certainty, and that makes you dangerous. For a while, you might try to hide what's happening. You learn to code switch, to present different versions of yourself depending on the audience. With your old friends, you laugh at the same jokes, gossip about the same topics, pretend the ground beneath your feet hasn't shifted. With your family, you nod along during religious observances, mouth the prayers without believing them, maintain the appearance of who you used to be. At work, you're the consummate professional, discussing quarterly projections with appropriate enthusiasm while internally recognizing the provisional nature of all such constructs. This double life seems wise at first, a form of spiritual discretion, honoring people's readiness to hear certain truths. But living this way drains you in ways you don't initially recognize. The exhaustion isn't just mental or emotional, it's existential. You're fragmenting yourself across multiple realities, never fully present in any of them. The energy required to maintain these separate personas, to constantly monitor what you can and cannot say, to suppress insights and perceptions that arise naturally, becomes unbearable. You realize that authenticity isn't some luxury or spiritual ideal. It's a basic requirement for psychological and spiritual health. Hiding your transformation doesn't protect others from discomfort. It slowly suffocates the very thing in you that's trying to emerge. The discretion that seemed like wisdom reveals itself as a sophisticated form of self-betrayal, and you understand that genuine growth requires you to stop apologizing for having outgrown old containers. This recognition often precipitates what mystics call the dark night of the soul. You've released your grip on the old identity, the familiar ways of being, but the new hasn't yet stabilized. You're in the void between stories, between selves, and this void is characterized by profound loneliness and disorientation. The landmarks you once navigated by have disappeared. The relationships that defined you have fallen away or fundamentally altered. The beliefs that gave life meaning have revealed themselves as useful fictions, but nothing more. You stand in a kind of existential no man's land, too changed to return to who you were, but not yet clear about who you're becoming. This is perhaps the most difficult phase of the entire journey, because there's nothing to hold on to. No map that shows where you are or where you're heading. During this dark night, the loneliness becomes so acute that you question whether the transformation was worth it. You remember the comfort of certainty, the security of belonging to a tribe that shared your beliefs, the ease of knowing your place in the social order. Was it really necessary to question everything? Couldn't you have remained content with the conventional life you were living? These doubts are natural, even necessary. They ensure you're not bypassing genuine human needs for connection and belonging in favor of some spiritual ideal. But if you sit with the loneliness long enough, if you don't run from it through distraction or by trying to force yourself back into old patterns, something shifts. The loneliness reveals itself, not as a problem to be solved, but as a portal to be entered. Within the very heart of isolation, you discover a different kind of connection, not to other people or beliefs or identities, but to existence itself, to the vast consciousness that animates all forms. And here's what I need you to hear clearly. This journey, this outgrowing of others, is not about becoming superior to them. Nothing could be further from the truth. True spiritual growth doesn't inflate the ego. It gradually reveals the ego's transparent nature. When you genuinely see through the illusion of the separate self, you cannot position yourself as better than anyone, because you recognize there's ultimately no separate self to be better. What you're experiencing isn't elevation but expansion, not superiority, but a shift in consciousness that allows you to hold more complexity, more paradox, more uncertainty than you previously could. People are on different paths, operating at different levels of consciousness, and this isn't a value judgment. It's simply an observation of how development unfolds. A 5-year-old isn't inferior to a 15-year-old. They're simply at different stages of development with different capacities and different ways of making meaning. When you outgrow certain people, you're not leaving them behind because they're less valuable or less important. You're recognizing that your paths have diverged, that you're now speaking different languages, that the resonance you once shared has shifted into dissonance. This recognition requires compassion rather than judgment. The people you've outgrown aren't wrong or asleep or unconscious. They're simply where they are, just as you're where you are. Perhaps in different circumstances, different lifetimes, the positions would be reversed. Now here's something I want you to try, something that will help integrate what we're exploring. Pause for a moment and identify one relationship in your life where you sense this divergence, where you've outgrown someone you once felt close to. Don't think of it as a negative thing or something you need to fix. Just acknowledge it honestly. Then, in the comments, share what's been hardest about that experience. Not the person's name or identifying details, just what aspect of growing apart has challenged you most. Has it been the guilt, the loneliness, the judgment you feel from them, or the judgment you catch yourself making about them? Name it. Speak it into existence. And if this video has resonated with you, if you're recognizing your own journey in these words, consider subscribing to this channel. We're building something here, a space where these conversations can happen without apology, where transformation is honored rather than pathologized. Your presence here matters more than you might realize. As you move through this difficult passage, as you navigate the loneliness of having outgrown your familiar world, something unexpected begins to happen. You start noticing others who are on similar journeys. They appear through strange synchronicities. A conversation overheard in a coffee shop, a book that falls off a shelf at precisely the right moment, an online community where people speak the language you thought only you understood. These connections feel different from your previous relationships. There's less need for pretense, less energy spent maintaining social facades. You can speak about your experiences without censoring yourself, without translating everything into acceptable language. The recognition is immediate and profound. You see it too. You've been through this too. I'm not alone in this after all. These new communities form not around shared beliefs or ideologies, but around shared questions and similar levels of consciousness. You discover that there are others who've walked through the same dark night, who've experienced the same disorientation and loneliness, who've also paid the price of transformation. Together, you create new kinds of tribes, not based on conformity to fixed ideas, but on mutual support for ongoing growth and exploration. These relationships don't demand that you stop evolving or stay consistent with who you were last year. They celebrate change rather than resist it. They offer mirrors that reflect your highest potential rather than your conditioned limitations. This discovery changes everything about the journey. You realize that outgrowing one level of consciousness, one community, one set of relationships, doesn't condemn you to permanent isolation. It's simply the natural rhythm of spiritual development. We grow together until our paths diverge. We walk alone through periods of transformation, and then we find new companions who match our current frequency. The pattern repeats throughout a lifetime. Each cycle involves loss and grief and loneliness, but also discovery and expansion and renewed connection. The key is not resisting the cycle, not trying to force yourself to remain small enough to fit into containers you've outgrown, and not hardening your heart against future connections because previous ones ended. Let me speak directly to what you might be feeling if you're in the midst of this transition. Yes, the loneliness is real. The sense of not being understood is real. The grief of losing relationships that once sustained you is real. These aren't signs that you've made a mistake or that something's wrong with you. They're the natural consequences of transformation, the price we pay for expanding beyond our previous limitations. But consider what you're gaining in exchange for what you're losing. You're discovering an authentic self that exists independent of others' opinions and expectations. You're developing the capacity to think for yourself rather than accept inherited beliefs without examination. You're learning to trust your own experience rather than defer to external authorities. You're recognizing yourself as consciousness temporarily wearing a human form, rather than as a human struggling to become spiritual. The relationships that fall away weren't failures. They served their purpose for a particular chapter of your life. The communities you've outgrown weren't wrong for you. You simply needed different containers as you expanded. Even the loneliness you're experiencing now isn't punishment. It's a crucible that burns away false identities and superficial connections, leaving only what's essential and true. What you're left with after this burning is more real than anything you've experienced before. A self that isn't constructed from others' expectations, relationships built on genuine seeing rather than social convenience, and a connection to existence itself that doesn't depend on external validation. The false identities you've released were prison cells you'd mistaken for homes. The conditioning you've shed was programming you never consciously agreed to. The certainties you've surrendered were security blankets that kept you comfortable but small. What's emerging through the cracks in your old life is the authentic you, the consciousness that existed before society told you who to be, the infinite potential that got squeezed into the narrow definition of a separate self, trying to survive in a hostile universe. This is who you actually are beneath all the layers of conditioning, beneath all the stories and beliefs and identities you've accumulated. And I'll tell you something. Once you taste this authenticity, once you experience the freedom of living from your actual being rather than from conditioned patterns, you'll never want to go back, no matter how lonely the journey becomes. The worthwhile exchange isn't just philosophical theory. It's a lived reality that everyone who walks this path eventually encounters. Yes, you may lose friends who cannot understand your transformation. Yes, family members may view you with suspicion or concern. Yes, communities that once embraced you may push you away. These losses hurt. They're meant to hurt. You're severing connections that ran deep, releasing relationships that mattered, acknowledging that love alone isn't always enough to bridge differences in consciousness. But what you discover on the other side of these losses makes them bearable, even necessary. You find that you can breathe more deeply, speak more honestly, live more authentically than you ever could, while trying to fit yourself into shapes that no longer match your inner reality. The people who fall away weren't meant to accompany you through this particular phase of your journey. That doesn't diminish what you shared with them or make those relationships less meaningful. It simply recognizes that we're all on our own paths, and sometimes those paths run parallel for a while before diverging. The divergence isn't a failure of love or connection. It's the natural unfolding of different trajectories, different callings, different levels of consciousness seeking their own expression. Holding on to relationships that no longer serve mutual growth isn't loyalty. It's often a subtle form of mutual limitation, where both parties agree to stay small enough to maintain the connection. When you finally accept this, when you stop fighting the natural process of outgrowing certain people and situations, something remarkable happens. The grief transforms into gratitude. You appreciate what those relationships taught you, how they supported your growth up to a certain point, even how their limitations pushed you to expand beyond them. You stop villainizing people who couldn't understand your transformation or making yourself wrong for changing. Instead, you recognize the perfection of it all, how you needed those relationships to become who you were, and how you needed to outgrow them to become who you are now, and how you'll likely outgrow who you are now to become who you'll be next. This is the spiral nature of growth. We don't ascend in straight lines, but in circles that gradually rise, revisiting similar themes at deeper levels of understanding. Each cycle involves integration and then transcendence, belonging and then separation, certainty and then the willingness to not know. The loneliness you feel now is preparing you for a different kind of connection, one based not on shared conditioning, but on authentic resonance. The isolation is teaching you to find completion within yourself rather than seeking it through others. The grief is opening your heart to hold more compassion, both for yourself and for everyone who struggles with transformation. So here we are, at the end of this exploration, though really we're at the beginning of your next chapter. If you've stayed with me through this entire journey, if these words have illuminated something in your own experience, I want to hear from you. Share your story in the comments. Tell us what you've learned from outgrowing people in your life. Describe how this video has shifted your perspective on the loneliness you've been carrying. Your story matters. Your experience adds to the collective wisdom we're building here. And if you haven't already, subscribe to this channel and become part of this growing community of seekers and truth-tellers, of people who've chosen authentic growth over comfortable stagnation. We need each other, especially during the times when we feel most alone. Together, we're creating a new kind of tribe, one that celebrates transformation rather than resists it, one that holds space for the beautiful, terrifying, necessary process of becoming who we truly are.